Okay, so good day everyone. So our topic for today is about the scope and the limitations and limitation of research. No? So the scope in delimitation of a thesis or research dissertation or research paper define the topics and boundaries of the research problem to be investigated. No? So the scope details how in-depth your study is to explore the research question and parameters in which it will operate in relation to the population and time frame. No? So the delimitation of the study are the factors and variables not to be included in the investigation. So in other words, they are the boundaries the researcher sets in terms of study duration, population size, and types of participants. No? Maybe somebody are always asking, how about the delimitation and limitation? Because there is a difference between the two. No? Again, delimitation refers to the boundaries of the research study based on the researcher's decisions of what to include and what to exclude. They narrow your study to make it more manageable and relevant to what you are trying to prove. So, on the other hand, limitations relate to the validity and reliability of the study. No? They are characteristic of the research design or methodology that are out of your control. Take note of it. Out of your control, but influence your research findings. Because of this, they determine the internal and external validity of your study and are considered potential weaknesses. So in other words, limitations are what the researchers cannot do. Yun yung elements outside of their control. And the delimitations are what the researcher will not do. This will be the elements outside of the boundaries they have set. No? Both are important because they help put the research findings into context. And although they explain how the study is limited, they increase the credibility and validity of the research project. Okay, to give us more details about the topic, let us all welcome our presenter. Go ahead, Ma'am Josie.
Yes, thank you, Prof. Thank you, Docs, for the reminders for the short definition of our topic today. Scope, delimitation, and limitation of the study in research. Let us now start for our discussion. Escape po na lang po siguro, Doc, tong energizer ko since yung aming first subject kanina, yung first course is accounting. So, possible lahat po kami gising na gising.
Okay, okay.
So now, let us start. What is scope in research? So, as a simple words, the scope of a study refers to all the aspects that it will cover or the boundaries within which it will be performed. This means that the researchers have to define what the study is focusing on. Similarly, they have to define what the study is not going to cover or to open the compromise or the limitations of the study. Then also the scope details how deep your study is to explore the research question and the parameters in which it will operate in relation to the population and time frame. Then how do I present the scope of my study? The scope of my study explains the extent to which the research area will be explored in the work and specifies the parameters within the study will be operating. Basically, this means that you will have to define what the study is going on to cover and what it is focusing on. Similarly, you also have to define what the study is not going to cover. This will come under the limitations. Generally, the scope of a research paper is followed by its limitations. As for my study, as a researcher, you have to be careful when you define your scope or area of focus. Remember that if you are broaden the scope too much, you might not be able to do justice to the work, or it might take a very long time to complete. We also must consider the feasibility of your work before you write down the scope. Again, if the scope is too narrow, the findings might not be generalizable. Why do we need to limit the scope of the study and research? It clarifies why specific data points to have been collected whilst other have been excluded. Without this, it's difficult to define an endpoint for a study or complete it within a reasonable time frame, since no limits have been defined of the work that could be take place. Then why we do need to limit the scope of the study? We need to limit the scope of the study because first of all, we have to choose a topic that we are going to focus on. If we're going to be on the boundary, or we have to no limits for scope of the study, then the research will be too general and the main purpose of the study will not be met. The reason for limiting scope of the study is to have a specific and clear goal of finishing the study. Limiting the scope helps to know why the study exists and how it can help reduce the problem faced by the world. Okay, what is the scope of study example? Here, the scope of study explains the extent to which the research area will be explored. The study specifies the parameters within which the study will be operating. Thus, the scope of a study will define the purpose of the study, the population size and the characteristics, geographical location, the time period within the study will be conducted, the theories that the study will focus on, and others. For example, your study is about online personal banking, but it will not be possible for you to cover all banks, di ba po? And all individual who use the online banking systems. Napakadami po nun kung magiging specific po tayo. Therefore, you can maybe specify that your study will cover 100 people of one particular area and examine their use of online banking system. So we must focus at least 100 persons. And then another example is yung particular area, and then kung sino-sino yung nag-use ng online banking. So dapat we must be specific. Okay, now guidelines on how to write a scope. Ito ba yun? Ay, sorry. Okay. Guidelines on how to write a scope. A good scope statement will answer the following 6 questions. We must remember the why, what, where, when, who, and how. That is the guidelines on how to write a scope. Then let us discuss first the who. Who is the subject matter of the study and the population from which will they be selected. This population needs to be large enough to be able to make generalizations. And then what? What is the subject to be investigated? And the included variables. Then when? The time frame within which the data is to be collected. Where? The location or setting of the study, Example is the data will be gathered and to which entity the data will be belong. And then why? The general aims and objectives o yung tinatawag po natin purpose of the research. Doon po included yung why. And then yung how. The last is the research is to be conducted, how the research is to be conducted, including a description of the research design, whether it's experimental research, qualitative research, or a case study. Example is the methodology, research tools, and analysis techniques. So we can apply daw po the methodology, research tool, and analysis techniques. Then for me, to make things as clear as possible, you should also state why specific variables were omitted from the research scope. And whether this was because it was the delimitations or limitations. You should also explain why they could not be overcome with the standard research methods backed up by the scientific evidences. So now let us discuss the difference between delimitations and limitations. As per Doc Abante explained a while ago, the delimitations refer to the boundaries of the research study based on the researcher's decision of what to include and what to exclude. They narrow your study to make it more manageable and relevant to what you are trying to prove. In addition, the delimitations of a study are the factors and variables not to be included in the investigations. In other words, they are the boundaries of the researchers sets in terms of the study durations, population size, and type of participants and others. So dapat daw po nating i-compromise o yung andun sa factors na kung saan meron lang po tayong boundaries na kung saan tayong researchers in terms of study of durations, population size, and type of participants. Since the delimitations parameters are within the researcher's control, readers need to know why they were set, what alternative options were available, and why these alternatives were rejected. For example, if you are collecting data that can be derived from the 3 different but similar experiments, the reader needs to understand how. First, the research objectives. Then the second is the research questions. And the last one is the research variables. Then we have also statistical analysis techniques and the target populations. Those are the examples of delimitations in research. So those 5, yung research objectives, research questions, research variables, target populations, and statistical analysis techniques are those examples of delimitations include. So we must consider yung mga factors po doon sa research objectives, doon sa nasabi pong example. And now the limitations. Limitations relate to the validity and reliability of the study. They are characteristics of the research design or methodology that are out of your control but influence your research findings. Because of this, they determine the internal and external validity of your study are considered potential weaknesses. So in other words po, the limitations are what the researchers cannot do. Sabi nga po a while ago ni Sir Abante, it's the outside of their control. While the delimitations are what the researcher will not do. Outside the boundaries, so both are important because they help to put the research findings into context, although they explain how to study is limited. They increase also the credibility and validity of a research project. Example of limitations include issues with the sample and selections, insufficient sample size, population traits or specific participants for statistical significance, lack of previous research studies on the topic which has allowed to further analysis, limitations in the technology, instrument used to collect your data, and limited financial resources and or funding constraints. So what is an example of a limitation in the study? For example po, you regret not including a specific questions in a survey. So into retrospect could have been helped address in a particular issue that emerged later in the study. So acknowledge the deficiency but stating a need for further researchers to revise the specific method for gathering data. So that will be all po. Thank you po.
Okay, so again, I'll just want to give you some additional inputs related to the discussion. So as what we mentioned about the scope, the scope is the scope of the study refers to the parameters under which the study will be operating. The problem you seek to solve will fit within certain parameters. Think of the scope as a domain of your research. What's in the domain and what is not. You need to make it as clear as possible and what you will be studying and what factors are within the acceptance range of your study. Let's say, for example, if you're studying the ill effects of bullying on a middle school children, the scope could include both face-to-face bullying and cyberbullying in the grade level. On the other hand, limitations are matters and occurrences that arise in a study which are out of the researcher's control. They limit the extensity to which a study can go and sometimes affect the end result and conclusions that can be drawn. So every study, no matter how well it is conducted and constructed, has limitations. And this is one of the reasons why we do not use the words prove and disprove with respect to research findings. It is always possible that future research might cast doubt on the validity of any hypothesis or conclusion from a study. Your study might have access to only certain people in an organization, certain documents, and certain data. So these are limitations. Subsequent studies may overcome these limitations. Iba minsan may mga tao na ayaw magpa-interview, na yun ang target mo na, let's say, ang target mo mga heads. Pero hindi lahat ng heads nagpapa-interview. So yun yung mga limitations. Mayroong mga documents na hindi ibinibigay. Let's say financial. Kung ang pinag-uusapan natin yung business financial stability. Pero available naman yan sa di ba? Sa Department of Finance, di ba? Pwede natin makuha yan. Actually, online available yan. Yung mga ganung bagay, yun yung mga limitations. Again, as I mentioned, yung mga limitations na yon, pwedeng ma-overcome ng ibang nag-research. Yun mga possible gap na sinasabi natin. Paano ko ma-identify yung research gap? Yun yung mga possible. Dinilimit niya, pero pwede mo pala siyang magawa. Because a limitation associated with qualitative study is related to validity and reliability. Because qualitative research occurs in the natural setting, it is extremely difficult to replicate study. So when you select okay, so when you select certain methodologies in design, let's say for example, phenomenology, they come with limitations over which you may have little control. Okay? So, in a limitations of a case study, let's say, no, we cannot make casual inferences from case studies because we cannot rule out alternative explanation. It is always unclear about the generality of the findings of a case study because a case study involves the behavior of one person, group, or organization. So the behavior of this one unit of analysis may or may not reflect the behavior of similar entities. Di ba? Because again, we need to consider individual differences, no? So case studies may be suggestive of what may found in a similar organization, but additional research would be needed to verify whether findings from one study would generalize elsewhere. When it comes to the limitation of a correlational studies, no? A correlational studies merely demonstrate that we can predict the behavior of one variable from the behavior of another variable. So if the relationship exists, then there is an association between variables. However, two variables can be associated without there being a causal relationship between the variables. So if we find that X is associated with Y, it could mean that X cos Y and Y cos X, or some third variable, no? So correlation sorry. Correlation research or correlational research may also have limitations with respect to the generality of the findings. Perhaps the study involved a specific group of people, or that the relationship between the variable was only investigated under some situations or circumstances. Thus, it may uncertain whether the correlational findings will generalize to other people or situations. Now, how about the limitation of randomized experiments? No? So, experiments involving the random assignment of participants to conditions sometimes allow us to make causal conclusion if the variables that are manipulated are not compounded with other variables. So, experiments gain rigor by controlling for influences outside of the variable of interest. Now, however, there still may be limitation with respect to the generality of the findings, and the experiment may have involved a specific group of people, certain situations, and only some of the possible conceptualization of variable. Thus, we may not know whether the findings will generalize to other people, no? Situations, or conceptualization of the variables. No? Within particular bounds, significant findings from an experimental study may infer a general cause, but the presence of other unmeasured variables can limit that inference. No? So, the limitation for the survey instrument, no? Kasi kadalasan survey tayo, no? Meron tayong questionnaire, survey questionnaire, no? So, surveys that are distributed with time constraint were noted, no, as problematic in that people who struggle with real or perceived time constraint are less likely to respond to survey because these possible respondents feel overworked and they just do not have the time to complete the survey. Anong ginagawa nila? Kung meron kang 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, check na lang. 5, 5, 5. Or para safe, ginagawa nila, check na lang si 3, 3, 3, 3. So, hindi siya reliable. Kaya nga po, as much as possible, pag gagawa tayo ng survey questionnaire, see to it na yung, ititik na lang, then huwag masyadong napakahaba nung sinasabi. Direct to the point. No? May itatanong ka pero ang istorya napakahaba pa. Diba? So kaya gano'n, nagkakaproblema tayo sa results. Kasi ako personally, kung may nakikiusap sa akin, okay Doc, will you please, anong tawag dito, paki-validate naman po ng questionnaire ko. I-send sa akin. Pag sinend sa akin, alang haba ng mga readings. Ako personally, honestly, syempre, ayoko namang mag-sign na hindi ko siya na-review. Diba? Syempre, kailangan ng sign ko na in-approve ko yung questionnaire. Siyempre ako personally, hanggat maaari talaga, iniintindi ko siya kung okay, hindi. Kaya lang, sa iba kasi kapag sobrang daming ginagawa, baka hindi na siya sinasagutan by heart. So as much as possible, ang ating mga questionnaire, survey questionnaire, talagang madali siyang, hindi direct to the point yung mga questions, madali siya intindihin. Because unlike an interview, where respondent can ask clarifying question, no? Respondent are usually limited to the text in the survey itself for direction about how to complete it and where to respond. Now, how about the delimitation? Actually, when I was in college, hindi pa ako masyadong sa delimitations eh. Since I am in the field of IT, pag sinabi naming limitation, ito yung mga pagkawala ng kuryente, uncontrollable. Ito yung pagkawala ng internet connection habang nagpe-perform yung mobile apps na ginawa namin. How about the delimitations? No? The delimitations or the delimitations of the study are those characteristics that arise from limitations in the scope of the study. So, defining the boundaries and by the conscious exclusionary and inclusionary decisions made during the development of the study plan. Ito yung mga nilalagay natin sa recommendations na, halimbawa, right after nating matapos yung research natin, tapos ito yung mga nakita natin, tapos parang bakit hindi mo lagyan ng ganito? Bakit 'yon? Tapos ilalagay natin sa recommendations, no? I-recommend natin sa susunod na gagawa or mag-aaral lang ganitong klase ng proposal. No? Yun yung mga nasa delimitations. Okay? So, unlike limitation, which flow from implicit characteristics of method and design, delimitations result from specific choices by the researcher. Para bang, bakit ang study mo, ang covered mo lang is buong North Manila or 5th District ng Manila? Kasi possibly, nasabi nga natin pag nagay tayo ng scope, siguraduhin natin na smart, di ba? Specific and so on and so forth. Then, kapag sa tingin natin magkakaproblema tayo sa time, instead na buong NCR, nag-focus tayo sa District 5. No? Na possibly, na iba yung practice ng District 1, District 2, District 3, District 4, and 5. Na possible yon. No? So, among these are the choices of objectives in questions, variables of interest, the choice of theoretical perspectives, and were adapted the paradigm, no, either qualitative, quantitative, or minsan mix, no. Pero syempre challenging yon, no, kapag may quality ka na at the same time may quantitative ka pa. So kung medyo mahaba yung time, wala namang problema, no, na may quali ka, may quanti ka. Pero most commonly either quali or quanti lang tayo. No, pero pag sa doctorate degree or even sa master's degree, ina-advise kung possible yung study mo ay mixed, no, mix ng quali, quanti, yon, ina-advise yon. So, the methodology, the theoretical framework, and the choice of participant must also consider on choices on objectives. No? So, the first delimiting step is the choice of problem, implying that there were other related problems that could have been chosen but were rejected or screened off from view. Okay? So to elucidate the delimitation of your study, review each decision you had to make it putting together your study. So in your purpose of the statement, you declare what your study intends to accomplish. Take note of it, ha? Doon pa lang sa ating purpose statement, dapat na-define na natin kung ano yung gusto nating ma-accomplish sa ating proposal. So in the delimitation section, you can repeat this declaration along with a pronouncement of what the study does not intend to cover. So in the latter case, your decisions for excluding certain pursuits are likely based on such criteria as not directly relevant, too problematic because not feasible, and the like. Make this reasoning as explicit as possible. Okay, so I think that's it for this topic.